So let's have a look at the British legislation that really caused these issues. So we have the Navigation Acts of 1650, well, that lasted from 1651 to 1773, right? So looking at these acts, this act now, right, it was one of the main economic issues that we had. So it was enacted by Britain to really regulate colonial trade and increase revenue for the crown, right? So what we're looking at is restricting colonial trade to exclusively British ships and certain ports, right? So it aimed to limit the competition between British merchants and bolster Britain's mercantilist economic policies, right? So it all know it wasn't not consistently enforced, right? The acts created resentment among the colonists who sought greater economic freedom, right? So greater economic freedom was one of the things that they looked at within Enlightenment principles, right? Laissez-faire trading, right? We also the Sugar Act of 1764, right, imposed duty on imported sugar, right, and different goods, right, like wine and coffee and cloth, etc., right? So it was intended to raise the revenue to help cover the cost of defending and administering the colonies. Now, this act specifically, personally, I think it was a sound act per se, because you run an entire empire. Britain runs the entire empire specifically, and they have all these colonies out here, and these colonies have to be protected by the British Navy, right? Therefore, it would be very expensive to continuously protect these colonies. So it was an act, right? It could have been a facade, right? They could have said, okay, we're gonna implement this act, right, because we're spending so much money to defend and administer the colonies, right? That could have been a facade. But if it was to really administrate, if it was really for administrative issues, right, and defending the colonies, then it would have made sense, right? It also aimed at discouraging smuggling and enforced trade regulations, right? So what we're looking at now, if there are any breaches of the other acts, right, that or the other mercantilist policies, the T Act would actually even will try to really fight against those issues, right? So they're trying to discourage any type of smuggling and enforce trade regulations, right, that would bolster British revenue, right? So obviously this would provoke anger among the colonists, right, who view this as a violation of their rights to be taxed without representation in Parliament. All right. The Stamp Act of 1765. We know that in this act now the colonists were required to purchase special stamps, stamp papers for every legal document, right? Licensed newspaper pamphlets, etc. Right. So the first direct tax imposed on the colonies by Parliament rather than on trade goods. So we're looking at now the acts imposed by Parliament started to spread to other things except other than rather trade goods, right? So this will spark widespread protests and resistance, including the formation of the Sons of Liberty and the Stamp Act Congress, right? So it led to non-importation agreements and boycotts of British goods, forcing Parliament to repeal the act the following year in 1776. All right. And the Sons of Liberty, we know that Sons of Liberty would have been what? They were a revolutionary party, a revolutionary group within the colonies at the time, right? And they really emboldened the slogan "No taxation without representation." They were one of the groups that really took into their hands the independence of the colonies, right? So a lot of the founding fathers of the United States were actually members or associated with the Sons of Liberty. All right, the Townshend Acts. All right, so it basically imposed duties on important goods such as tea, glass, and paper. Right, so at the time, right, these would have been essential things, right, for the upper class, right, for the whites, for the persons living within colonies, right, it would have been essential, right. So what they're trying to do is actually impose taxes on all types of essential goods so they can make enough money to restore the treasuries after the 7 Years' War. So this created a new revenue collection mechanism for the British, right? So it also established, right, the precedent of using revenue from these duties to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, making them less dependent on colonial um, assemblies, right? So we're basically seeing here now The Townsend Act not only creates another way or another mechanism for British to now actually make money, right, or actually to replenish their treasuries, right, but also another way to try to get the legal personnel of the colonies to actually be more dependent on Britain and less dependent on the colonial assemblies. So they would use this money now to pay the judges and the colonial governors, right? So it is technically a power move that we see here from the Townsend Acts, right? And it renewed colonial opposition and boycotts, right? The general opposition that we saw from the Stamp Act, it's cooled down after the repeal of the Stamp Act, but the Townsend Act actually renewed these issues, leading to increased tensions and incidents such as the Boston Massacre, right? So the Townsend Act was one of the major proponents for that specifically. And we know that the Boston Massacre specifically occurred on March 5th, 1770, right? So it occurred in Boston, Massachusetts, right? So this was basically, it really occurred from some amount of tension between some civilians and some British officers, really, right? So there would have been resentment from these acts before, right? And there would have been some amount of confrontational attitudes between the groups of colonists and the British soldiers guarding the customs house, right? So what's basically, well, the customs house, that would be like general customs. Technically, yeah, it's gonna be technically the same thing as what we have nowadays, right? So all the money and those type of things, right, would have been collected and brought to custom houses and then shipped over to Britain, right? So these angry group of colonists now would have been confrontational with the soldiers guarding the custom house, right? In the chaos, the British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists and injuring several others, right? And this highlighted really the start of anti-British sentiment within the colonies, right? This is where the real anti-British sentiment within the colonies actually started, right? So obviously, majority of the colonies were really up in arms with the British, but at this point, then we're going to see a more violent approach, right, to the British. Okay. Then the Tea Act of 1773 granted the British East India Company a monopoly on the importation and sale of tea in the colonies, right? So this aimed at at re, re well, it's really aimed at rescuing. Yeah, so it really aimed at rescuing the financial troubles, right, of the East India Company, right, by selling tea in surplus directly to the colonies at a lower price, right? So what's been basically happening here, right? This act specifically was one of the major issues as well, right? So all of these are issues, right? But we know from studying history for a while that there are always a lot of issues, multiple issues leading up to a conflict, right? But there's always this powder keg, as we would describe it, right? This last thing that drive the final nail into the coffin, and many persons tend to see this as the Tea Act, right? So the Tea Act really caused a lot of issues within the colonies, and the colonial merchants really saw it as an attempt to really boycott their businesses or undercut their businesses, right? So what's basically happening here now? Tea is being sold at the colonies at a much more competitive price, right, than the colonial merchants themselves, right? And this really culminated in the Boston Tea Party, right? So the Boston Tea Party specifically, right, we would know what that would be, right? So could anybody just describe the Boston Tea Party?
Sir, members, if I'm not mistaken, members of the Sons of Liberty went onto some ships and I think threw away about a lot of, if it's not sugar, it's
Some Bostonians they hid their identity and they boarded a British ship and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. And yeah,
Okay, so both persons are more or less correct, right? So we're looking at that. So the Boston Tea Party of December 16th, right? 1773. right? We're looking at that specifically. So it was really a protest against the Tea Act, right? Really just that protest, right? So we have some Bostonians, as was described, right, dressed as Indians, right, Mohawk Indians. Well, I wouldn't call them Indians; they were Native Americans. Indians refer to them as the false name, really. So they were dressed as Native Americans, and a group of these colonists would have boarded the ships, and 342 chests of tea was dumped in the harbor, destroying the cargo specifically. Right, so this was seen as a total defiance against the British authority and taxation, further escalating the tensions between the colonies and Britain. So after that, we had the implementation of the Intolerable Acts of 1774, right? So it was passed in response to the Boston Tea Party, right? And these punitive measures aimed to assert British authority, right, and punish the colony of Massachusetts, right? So they closed down the entire port of Boston, right?
Excuse me,
Go
sir.
ahead.
Could you go back on? Sir,
This
could you go back onto the previous slide, please?
this
One more.
one, this one's fine.
All right. Thank you.
All right, no problem.
Yes, sir. It's okay.
Okay, so the Intolerable Acts was a response to that Boston Tea Party now, right? And what we're looking at now, right, is the fact that they closed the port of Boston until the tea destroyed in the Boston Tea Party was paid for. So they closed on the harbor, right, and they actually sent troops into private homes, right, using the Quartering Act as well, which was a part of the Intolerable Acts, right. So the Intolerable Act speaks to a multiple pieces of legislation that were deemed as intolerable, right. So that's why they're the Intolerable Acts, right? So the first thing was to close on the harbor, right, and force the people of Massachusetts to pay for the tea that they destroyed, right? And it strengthened the power of the royal governor and limited town meetings as well. So now they were assuming more political and stringent control over them, right? And then the Quartering Act, as I mentioned before, British troops were now allowed to now enter private homes, right? And this led to widespread colonial outrage and increase in solidarity among the colonies as other colonies provided support for Massachusetts, right? So this was really the intolerable acts there. And those were really the acts of British legislation that really led up to the American War of Independence that we would describe, right? So the slogan "No taxation without representation," right? Really, I included a slide about the analysis of the phrase specifically, right? And it really it originated from the British political thought, right, and concept of parliamentary sovereignty, really, right? So the British themselves, right, after going through the Enlightenment, would have accepted some principles within the Golden Revolution, right? We don't learn about the Golden Revolution, but it was a revolution that took place in Britain, right, before these issues, right, where they established this parliamentary, not the democracy, parliamentary monarchy, right? So the Americans themselves took this core principle of safeguarding against any type of arbitrary taxation that was kind of actually within the right of Parliament, and saying that if they had the representation specifically, right, then they could have actually made some decisions, right, as well as defend themselves from being exploited by these acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, etc. Right. So the slogan really was about actual representation. Really, it was about the Enlightenment principles, looking at parliamentary sovereignty and the fact that a people themselves, right, live within a social contract between themselves and the government, right? And the social contract, would have learned of John Locke and his social contract, right? Saying that this unfair leadership or this unfair political control and political exploitation by the British government, right, breach the social contract with the individuals living within the colonies. Now they have the right, or most of them see that now they have some amount of natural will to overthrow this oppressionary system, right? And to now demand that they will not answer to British laws or they will not tolerate British acts, right? Without having some amount of a representation within the parliament, right, or without having assemblies of their own. So it is important to note that phrase when writing SSR, when speaking about the issues that led to the American War of Independence, because that was one of the main things that we have to look at. That was one of the integral issues, right? So that led to all of this. All of these acts were imposed, right? And all of these things took place because, right, of the lack of representation, right? And that was one of the issues and the main issue that we could speak about for the actual start of the War of Independence, right? So those were really the main issues there. Okay.